Everyone, to the Fort Detrick Business Development Office webinar series. Today's webinar is Government Contract Insurance, How to Avoid Catastrophic Loss. The session today will be taught by Andrew Berdahl and Gary Silverman. First, before we get started, we have a few webinar notes. I am Gloria Larkin, President of Target Gov. We are presenting this webinar in conjunction with the Fort Detrick Business Development Office. Let us tell you how today is going to run so the session runs smoothly. Right now, we are recording this as a live webinar. For those attending live today, you are online for the visual and dialed in via phone for the audio. If you are viewing this as a recording, you are seeing and hearing it via the Internet only. No need to dial in on your phone. During the live session, we mute the attendees so that background noises will be kept to a minimum. However, if you do need to take another call, please hang up on this line and call back when you want to return. You will be allowed in. If you put the line on hold, your on-hold message may be heard by others. We will also ask you to send your questions in by email. This will work very well as if you're attending the live session or if you're listening to this as a recording. When you email your questions in, no matter when they are, we will respond to you. As a recording, this will be available 24/7 on demand, and you may have questions come up as you're listening to the webinar. We want to be able to address your questions and have the subject matter experts get back to you and help you with whatever you need regarding today's webinar. The email that we would like you to use is on your screen now. It is ask@fcbdo.com. Let me tell you that again. ask@fcbdo.com. We promise to answer every question asked either during today's live session or, again, if you're listening to this as a recording, remember, anytime you can send in your email question, and we promise to respond with a personal answer. If you are on a cell phone and you lose the connection, don't worry, you can call back and you will be readmitted. And if you do put your call on speakerphone to listen to it hands-free, please mute the line so that we do not hear your office background noises. And if you have any problems at all while you're on the line, live or as a recording, call our office number at 301-620-7071. We'll take live chat questions and emailed questions during today's session. Make sure that you jot down your questions. At the end, we'll offer to hear them live. And you can also use the chat function on your screen if you'd like to ask questions during the session. And just as a reminder, we want you to know that we are recording the webinar today to make it available to you for future access 24/7 on demand at your convenience. Well, the next hour is going to be full of very solid information for government contractors. Let me tell you a little bit about the presenters. Andrew Berdahl is the Chief Operating Officer of GovTech, the Government Technology Insurance Company Risk Retention Group. Licensed to operate in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, GovTech RRG is an association-owned insurance company formed for the purpose of and dedicated to providing affordable insurance, essential liability insurance to government IT and supporting services. Gary Silverman is the managing partner of the law firm of Silverman. Oh boy, Gary, you're going to have to help me with that. Theologo LLP, concentrating in the areas of business law, government contracts, estate planning, business succession planning, and commercial litigation. Mr. Silverman represents startups, small and mid-sized companies, and large, closely held IT and supporting service companies. I'd like to welcome both Andrew and Gary to today's session and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. This is Gary Silverman. We have about 12 slides to review today and work through government contracts, contract clauses, the insurance requirements of government contracts, and then talk a little bit about sample contract clauses, the types of insurance that will cover certain issues, and the types of insurance that are required and both not required or supplemental. So starting with the presentation outline, you'll see that we're going to discuss government contracts and clauses, government contract insurance requirements, government contracts terms and conditions, covered and not covered, which is an interactive slide, and insurance claims in the IT services business, and then go over some possible ways of covering insurance as well as conclusions to avoiding catastrophic loss. Moving on to the next slide. As most of you probably know, and folks that are engaged in the IT services business know, government contracts are typically fall into several types of categories. You have your full and open contract. Most small businesses are typically have some sort of set-aside through either SBA or GSA. There's also service-disabled veteran-owned businesses known as SDVOBs, and, of course, minority-owned businesses. All government contracts are going to be subject to, whether they're prime or subcontracts, subject to the FAR, and those provisions will both be in a prime contract and will be flow down from the contracts from prime contractors. Terms and conditions of most contracts will typically include non-disclosure provisions, default and cure provisions, and indemnification provisions, and other provisions that a prime contractor will require. As well, what you'll typically see is flow-down provisions from the FAR that a prime contractor will require of its subcontractors, and what you will also see are specific contract clauses that don't necessarily speak to insurance, but are insurable, and we'll go through those provisions and discuss how those provisions will either allow you to insure against loss or, in the event you choose not to, possibly create losses or issues for your company. Moving on to the next slide. I just went to the end for some reason. Government insurance contracts, and now we're on the fifth slide. Government contracts, prime contract and subcontract clauses will typically include, obviously, FAR requirements. The FAR outlines the various insurances that are required, mandate insurance of any prime contractor, subcontractor, subcontractor, or anyone who is working on government contracts. Those insurance typically include general liability insurance, workers' compensation, comprehensive general liability, automobile, aircraft, passenger, and passenger liability insurance. What you will normally see in the contracts that you'll either sign with the government or that you will sign as a subcontractor are provisions that will require these types of insurance to specific limits. Most companies will carry these types of insurance, general liability, workers' compensation. Some even will carry auto and aircraft liability insurance. The things that most people don't think to or work towards are the insurances that are not mentioned. Now, some prime contracts will say that you need to have errors and omissions insurance or professional liability insurance, but they are typically not FAR requirements or prime contract requirements. More often what you'll see is contractors will require you to insure against certain acts and certain things that are done by your contractors, your employees, your 1099s that become your responsibilities. And as we put it in these slides, these are requirements and further assurances that you must make as a subcontractor or as a prime contractor to the government that will be contained in your contract, but not necessarily language that you'll say this is a specific insurance requirement. The next slide talks about the typical contractual terms that you'll see in a contract that, again, won't specifically say you must insure against, but you'll be liable for. You will see typically in a contract language that says that a contractor is required to extend liability of any of all acts beyond the entity and to its officers and directors. You'll see clauses that require a subcontractor to insure against the acts of its employees and guarantee that all work performed that is performed and any work that is not performed is insured against, and it will provide for extraordinary damages and indemnification against claims. You'll also see a subcontractor required to indemnify against any issues that may arise out of employee disputes or harassment claims. You'll also see a requirement that you insure against the acts of your subcontractors in 1099s. So specifically what we're talking about is you'll see provisions in a contract that will require you to insure against, indemnify, and hold harmless against certain acts of your employees, of your 1099s, and of your subcontractors that don't necessarily say you must provide insurance, you must insure against, you must buy insurance, but these are acts that you're required to insure against, and if you do not, you will be left in a situation where you personally or your company will be in a situation where you will pay for these losses in the event they occur. Well, let's move on to the next slide, and you'll see a little bit more about what we're talking about. Most contracts will include sample clauses like the one that's attached here. What we did is create a situation where the slide really includes all of the possible language that you'll see in a contract that will be jumbled together in probably 5 or 6 or 7 clauses, but put in this one sample clause so you can see all of the issues that could potentially arise in these types of situations. So let's read through it and work through it. A subcontractor agrees to indemnify and save harmless a client and prime contractor. What necessarily does that mean? Well, for the 25 years I've been practicing law, we've come up with lots of great language that most people don't understand so that we can continue to practice law for the next 25, 50, and 100 years. But specifically what that language is telling you is indemnify means that you, as a third party, will cover all of the costs and all of the expenses of the person that you are indemnifying in the event you do certain things. What does save or hold harmless mean? What that means is that any cost that they incur or are forced to incur or any losses that they incur, you will pay for those. So what indemnification and hold harmless means, and again, you'll see this language all through everything you do in any contract you sign or subcontract you sign, but specifically what you'll see in all of these contracts is language that says that you will pay for any loss of the person you are contracting with. You will hold them harmless against any loss of that person that you are contracting with, and any issues they have with you or with any of the people working with you, you agree to pay for any of those issues, to cover any of those losses, to defend against their claims. This is very big language, and it's the language that you'll see over and over and over again. We put one sample clause in, but I can assure you, you will not see a contract without this. And as we went through in the slides up above, these are not FAR flow downs. You will not see language like this in the FAR, but what you will see is specific insurance requirements in the FAR. Sometimes clauses will go beyond general liability and workers' comp, but typically what you will not see in the FAR is indemnifications and hold harmless. You'll see different language, but every flow down provision from the FAR will be included in the prime contract, and every provision of a prime contractor to a sub or a sub-sub or a 1099 will typically include this language. So if you are a subcontractor working with a prime contractor, if you are a 1099 working for a subcontractor, or even if you are a contractor working directly with the government, in addition to your FAR provisions, you will see language like this in different form. But be sure that you look for it, because indemnify and hold harmless basically means that you're responsible for any issues that are created for whoever you're contracting with. You will pay for their costs. You will pay for their loss. You will pay their attorney's fees. You will pay for all of that. So let's move on, because we just covered the first sentence here. Again, you will save harmless the client and prime contractor. So what that means is that you, as an individual, as a company, you will be, depending on what the status is of your entity, either sole proprietorship or corporation, will be responsible to indemnify and hold harmless not only who you're contracting with, but the end user. So if you're contracting with a large integrator, and that large integrator is working for the United States government, you're going to indemnify the client, the United States government, and the prime contractor. Let's move on. From and against any and all claims, liability, loss, expenses, suits, damages, demands, and costs, including legal fees and expenses. This is typical language that you will see in every single contract. I would be shocked that as a prime to the government or as a sub or 1099 to a prime, if this language is not included. So what does it mean? As we said before, all claims, which means anything, and any liability, loss, expense, suit, damage, judgment, demand, and cost, they've left nothing out here. And in most contracts you will see nothing left out. In parentheses, you'll see including legal costs and expenses. It's covered, but because most courts require that legal fees and expenses are clearly delineated, although it's already there, now it's here twice. So anything that you are involved in, and any damage, any loss, any expense, any judgment or demand that's made because of something you did, an employee did, a subcontractor did, a 1099 did, in some cases a guest, you are responsible for all of those losses, expenses, suits, and damages. And most of these clauses will go on to say arising out of. Now, sometimes in these clauses you'll see it just says everything. You're responsible for everything. Every single thing that any one of the people who are around you could possibly do, you're responsible. But most of the time you'll see language that looks a lot like this, that says arising out of. So let's move on to that. The acts, omissions, or negligence of the subcontractor. Well, that's kind of a great coverall. What does that say? You're responsible for your acts, the things you do. You're responsible for omissions, the things you didn't do. You're responsible for your negligence, which is the things that you did wrong. So in the event you committed an act that you thought you did wrong, or that you just plain did wrong, negligence will be covered. But the first word, acts, covers it anyway. Anything that you do or fail to do, you are responsible for. But it's not just you. It's your employees. It's the officers of your company, the directors of your company, or any subcontractors. And that includes any folks that are working with you as 1099s, because technically they're considered subcontractors. So if you take a look at all of the categories of folks included in here, it really should say anyone who is anyhow associated or any way associated with your company. Any of their acts, omissions, or negligence of those people will cause you to indemnify and save harmless the client and the prime contractor. So now that we've covered the coverall of acts and omissions, it drills down a little bit. Injury or death to person, including officers, directors, employees, subcontractors of the subcontractor. So anyone dies or is hurt on the project, at your place of business, going to or from your place of business, you will, and they are sued, or they have costs or liabilities or damages arising out of that, you are now responsible for that. Misrepresentations of, moving on to the next, misrepresentations of facts or fraud by the subcontractors to employees, directors, and officers. What you see here is a theme that continues to run through, which is there isn't just a liability for you or your company, but there's a liability for any of the acts of anyone around you. And again, I can assure you that this is typical language in most contracts. You will see this through and over again. It is not just your act or your employee's act, but it's the acts of the folks around you that are doing business with you, that are working with you, and that are your guests. Violation, next clause, violation of non-disclosure agreements or other obligations. Typically, you will sign non-disclosure agreements with either the government or with your prime contractor agreement. Sometimes you'll have your subcontractors sign those as well. In some cases, you're now seeing prime contractors not only requiring the subcontractor, you, to sign the non-disclosure agreements, but you'll also see that they're asking anyone working on a project to sign those non-disclosure agreements or NDAs. So what you'll see is your employees will be asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement for themselves, saying they will not violate the NDA, but the obligation, if they violate the NDA, is still placed on you. Your employees' failure to safeguard information and to not disclose information is an obligation that they've taken on in that situation. But what they've done is said, but if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, my employer, besides me, of course, my employer will be responsible to you as well. This is something we're seeing more and more of, and there's more and more litigation on this issue with regard to employees' failure to meet the requirements of a non-disclosure agreement that the employers are being held liable for. Now, another issue that I'd like to raise that's not necessarily specific to this sample clause, but is something we're seeing more and more of. More prime contractors, as well as the federal government, and subcontractors to their subcontractors, are requiring the liability to extend to officers and directors. And what you're seeing more of is, many years ago, again, when I first started practicing law, entities were created to protect the officers and directors and owners of companies from the liability of that company. Basically, the buck stops here. Maybe you'll lose everything in your company and the company will go bankrupt, but at least you'll get to keep your house and you'll get to keep all of the wonderful things you spent all of these years building. Well, 20 years later, or fast forward 20 years later, and what you're seeing more of is liability extending to officers and directors and sometimes shareholders of companies where the government or prime contractors are looking to see that these folks who are making the money have got what we call skin in the game so that they are now liable as well. And there are more and more suits that are being filed not only against the companies but against their officers and directors because contract clauses are now requiring that those folks put themselves up on the line. And in some instances, again, depending on the size of the company, when you're dealing with workers who are also owner shareholders, those folks are being asked to be liable as well. So what we're basically seeing here is besides the extension of the FAR to what we would call required insurance, which, as you all know, if you read the insurance clauses of your contract, you'll see general liability. You'll see workers' compensation. You'll see automobile and airplane. Sometimes, you'll see additional umbrella requirements in the FAR, and they're all there. They're not all flowed down, but they're all there. We are seeing contractors who are providing contracts that extend liability for insurance requirements beyond what is required under the FAR, but we'll also see these sample clauses or these contract clauses that will require indemnification and safe harmless of the prime and the client to damages in excess of typically what the policy amounts are. And these insurance, or I should say this additional liability, can extend to acts and omissions of all kinds, including the list that's here, that, again, your general liability insurance or your workers' compensation insurance or other types of required FAR insurance will typically not cover. And I know Andrew's going to speak a little bit more about what types of insurance there are and what will be covered and not covered and how you can insure against some of these supplemental issues that are in these contract clauses that don't necessarily require insurance, but typically you can insure against. So let me jump this over to Andrew.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much, Gary. This is Andrew Beardall, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Government Technology Insurance Company Risk Retention Group, a specialized insurance company for government IT risks. And I appreciate everyone letting us be here and tell you about this. If we could just zoom to the next slide here. Gary's just gone through some of the things that set the table that everyone's sitting down at. And he laid out all of the provisions that they attempt to put in to manage their risk. And these are efforts on behalf of the primes when they issue these contracts to try and protect themselves. Now, this slide begins to talk about that which can go wrong. All right? And these can all lead to, in the worst case scenario, litigation, whether it's between sub and a contractor, between a sub and a prime, or even with the United States coming after the contractors for their actions or inactions. So we're just going to go through a few of these, and these are things that can, have, and will continue to in the future give rise to claims. First one would be your failure or the failure of one of your employees or your subcontractors to complete a project on a timely basis. That's a no-brainer. If you don't do the job, you could get sued for it. The next one is harassment or other acts of employees or subcontractors at a work site or place of employment. Well, this is the sexual harassment type issue. This is the racial issue. This is the conflict that can exist between people in any kind of workplace. Now, the government's not going to require you to insure against it, but it's a problem. Companies can and do get sued for this. Companies can and do go out of business because of this. Next one, violation by you or your employees or subcontractors of non-disclosure or non-competes. Now, Gary went into those in a little bit more detail, but if you are sharing proprietary information between subs and primes, or if you are disclosing government information that you are not supposed to disclose, that opens you up to a world of liability. And we have seen that more and more in recent years, most recently with the Sony PlayStations that are in a massive legal quandary now because all of this information was stolen from their networks. And was that a violation by the employees directly? No. But it is the sort of thing that gives rise to legal issues. Now, injury, death, or destruction of property caused by you, your employees, or subcontractors. That's a pretty self-explanatory one. You break it, you buy it. You know, if you cause damage at someone else's facility, which, you as federal contractors, you can be on site in federal installations, in military bases, anything like that. You cause damage, you could be on the hook for that. And then the last one, sort of the catch-all, any act or omission that creates any loss for the government or prime contractor. Well, if there's a screw-up that causes a loss, if there's a screw-up that costs someone money, government doesn't want it to be their money, the prime doesn't want it to be theirs, so they're just going to keep passing it down the line until they get to you. So, if we can flip to the next slide, these are some situations. Now, we're going to assume that everyone out there, everyone that's listening that's a government contractor, has their general liability and their workers' comp as required by the FARs or its various subsidiaries. Now, the question becomes, what is covered and what is not covered by that? And if you can, feel free to respond on the little text box on your computer there. But the first situation is a guest of your company falls at your place of business. Is that covered by your general liability or your workers' comp? Well, the answer on that one is that yes, it would be. That is the classic premises liability that is the underlying foundation of general liability insurance. Now, the next one, you are sued by your failure to complete a project due to a delay caused by an employer or subcontractor. Would that one be covered by general liability or workers' comp? Now, the answer to that one is no. General liability is about your premises. Workers' liability is about somebody being hurt. But your failure to do your job, whether it was because one of your folks or a subcontractor, is not covered. But at the same time, it could certainly give rise to litigation coming down from on high. Now the next one of your employees harasses an employee of the government, the prime contractor, or another employee. That's one of your employees committing this questionable act. Are you covered by your general liability or workers' comp? And the answer in this case would also certainly be it's not. General liability, workers' comp do not cover actions like this. However, they also give rise to the sensationalistic lawsuits that you see in the newspaper that can bankrupt a company. Even if the company is found not liable, the legal fees themselves can suck them dry. Next one, you and your wife are sued personally due to your liability as officers or directors of your company. Is that covered by general liability or workers' comp? The answer on that one is also no. It has nothing to do with your premises. It has nothing to do with an injury. That is something that could open you up to litigation, open you up to substantial damages, but the insurance that you're required by the FAR to have does not protect you. Next one of your employees is hurt and files a claim. Would that be covered by general liability or workers' comp? And the answer on that one would be yes. That is the core of a workers' comp policy. Workers' comp exists so as to protect employees in their business places, and it is required by the government because they want all of the companies with whom they work to properly protect their employees. The next one of your subcontractors fails to complete a project. That one would not be covered. That's much like the one above, the second one. If you don't do the project, that has nothing to do with general liability or workers' comp. Yet, you're still on the hook, and you could be the subject of a lawsuit. And the last one, you are sued for an amount in excess of policy limits. Would that be covered by your general liability or your workers' comp? And the answer to that one is kind of. You see, general liability or workers' comp would cover you up to the limit, but anything above and beyond that could be on your shoulders. Let's move to the next slide here. And just talk about some of the claims that are made specific to the IT services sector. The basic insurance that, again, we're assuming all of you have, doesn't cover things like infringement of copyright or improper disclosure or defamation. These are issues that are becoming more and more prevalent in litigation against companies as our society becomes more and more information-based as opposed to product-based. Copyrights are as valuable as having the set of plans for Kentucky Fried Chicken. It is the value in the property there that is a part of our information world. And your normal insurance wouldn't cover you if you disclose something. General liability doesn't cover claims for improper or inaccurate installation, architecture, design, software development, or system integration. Right? That is the job that government IT contractors do. And your insurance covers you for mishaps, accidents, things like that, but it does not cover you for not doing your job right. And the third point, many of the lawsuits today request damages in excess of available policy limits. That's what we talked about before. You could be covered up to a point, but then it could be coming out of your own pocket. 40% of mid-sized companies have faced directors and officers lawsuits. That's what D&O is. Directors and officers. And 41% of companies can expect to face one. Directors and officers lawsuit is when they are coming after the directors, the officers, the owners, potentially even the stockholders of a company, trying to recover for the actions of that company. And the last point, EPLI judgment awards. Now, EPLI is employment practices liability. That is the harassment. That is the unlawful firing. I was fired because I'm a member of a minority. I'm fired because I'm a woman. I'm fired because I'm old. I'm fired because I'm a religious, because I'm bald. They have increased 275%. And right now, they're comprising 30% of U.S. civil litigation. And that is a vast amount when you think about it. When you think of all of the car accidents out there, all of the medical malpractice, all of the contract disputes, everything that falls under civil litigation, and 30% of them are employment practices liability. Now, these have been a bunch of scary scenarios over the course of the last 2